I'm gonna show you like the circuits, how we set up everything, and then you'll be able to go into lab and practice that today on the different ventilators. We will be assigning vents for you to work on each week, but we're not gonna do that today yet. So you guys had some homework, and one of the questions was, how do we provide power, or what is the input power to the ventilator? So Mitch, what's one way?
Pneumatic.
Okay.
Electric.
So one is pneumatic, and that means only pneumatic. And what is an example, Mitch, of one that works like that?
Bird.
Yeah, the IPPV. There are also transport vents. Some transport. Some work on batteries, some work on pneumatics.
Like the Hamilton T1 or something like that.
Yeah, there's a couple of them, I don't remember all the names. So, and then I heard someone else say another one would be electric, which means you don't need a pneumatic source to run it. It could be run on just only electric. And that example of that one is the LTV, which I heard some of you saw already. So, this does not need 50 PSI. It can actually just run off a battery and electricity. So it's an electric only ventilator. Yes?
So that's something that if someone wanted to live at home with the vent, they would have something like
This is one example of something that somebody could use at home without this screen, the screen. Some of them in the hospital have the screen, some don't. I like the screen for here so we can look at things and gives you a more of a visual. But the screen is optional. And one thing that's important to understand about the ventilator is you do not have to have oxygen. So when we're saying ventilation and oxygenation. So a ventilator is gonna ventilate. If somebody needs supplementary oxygen, we can add it into this type of ventilator. That's a home model or a transport model. But you'll find that especially long-term vented patients, like a neuromuscular patient maybe, who's gonna be on the vent for years, or little babies who go on home and they're on for years, at some point they don't need oxygen requirements unless maybe they get sick. They just need to be ventilated. So we can run this without O2 or we can add oxygen in. Does that make sense? Okay. So the third one is what? Combined. Yes, Carl. Yeah, combined.
say mixed, that's similar.
Whatever, yeah. At the end of the day, you need both, electric and pneumatic. And that's most of our ICU ventilators. They're gonna need both of those sources. So we need to be able to plug it into a power source and connect it to a pneumatic gas source. Yes?
Would a microprocessor be the combined?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Microprocessor is just the computer component of the ventilator, which they all have now. So not only do we have to worry about the vent parts, we have to worry about the computer parts as well. So, so these are gonna require both. So one thing that's important to understand, and I'll demonstrate when I hook up the servo there in the back, is that within the pneumatic requirement, it only needs one 50 PSI gas source. So technically, it could only be hooked up to oxygen or only hooked up to air. Because that would satisfy the requirement of a pneumatic gas source. Why would we use both? Why do we use both?
To give a separate version or a different FiO2.
Yeah, so there's internal blenders inside of there so that we can change our FiO2 to whatever we want. We have to be able to blend air into oxygen to be able to do that. So if you only had oxygen in the wall and no air mixed in with it, what would your FiO2 be? 100%. Does that make sense to everybody? And if I took out my oxygen and only had air, what would my FiO2 be? Room air. So those ventilators can function with only one of those gas sources, but in reality we use both. But I'm just telling you that in case something happens to one of your gas sources, your ventilator will still run. It's just going to change the FiO2 to whatever is still hooked up to it. So if it was, we lost air, it would go right to 100%. If we lost oxygen, it would go right to room air. Everybody good? Okay. Some of our vents have a built-in air compressor, And I'll have to take this in the back to show you, which I'm not gonna do till after the break. But the PB 840, which is this ventilator here, PB stands for Puritan Bennett. And it says it actually on the vent. It has a built-in air compressor. The Draeger also has the option to have a built-in air compressor. Of the vents that we have here, those two can have built-in air compressors. So that could take the place of the air that's in the wall. Because it would run off the air compressor instead.
Scrubbed air, like medical air, or is that oxygen?
No, it's just, it's not medical air, because medical air has to come through a medical air source, and remember, we have to take out all the filters and get rid of the particles and things like that. This is just plain old air coming from a basic air compressor like you use for welding and different types of things like that. And then the Draeger has the option to have an air compressor. Ours does not have one, but you would just see these big white boxes on the bottom, which again, I'll show you once I hook them up in the back. The Servo does not have the option to come with an air compressor, which is in the back, and neither does the G5. So the advantages to something like that is, let's say you have somebody that's been on the vent long term, and maybe they need to stay on the vent, but they're gonna transfer out of the ICU. Some hospitals have little wings where like long-term vent patients go. They might not have piped in air. And that's okay, I could use a vent that has a built-in air compressor. I can also use that without piped in oxygen if my patient is on room air, because it will provide the pneumatic gas source, the 50 PSI. Yes?
I just assume that's just gonna make it really loud.
It is loud, yep, and I'll show you. John,
Is there like risk of doing that? Because like if you're trying to go off a pump and the pump fails or something, like.
I mean, yeah, if the air compressor breaks down, but it'll alarm and then you would just replace it, just like any other thing. They're pretty dependable. Air compressors don't break down very often, so they run like tanks. So. Okay, any questions so far?
And what was the
Yep.
abbreviation to that one?
PB 840. Kaylee?
Can you repeat what you said about the oxygen? So if you don't have air in the patient's room, then the air compressor will work.
Correct.
If you don't have oxygen in the patient's room, then it'll use room air.
It'll use the same air compressor, but your patient would only be able to get room air.
Okay.
So like you couldn't have supplemental oxygen if you didn't have oxygen in the wall. So this could be used in like an old, like long-term facility that maybe has patients that don't need supplemental oxygen. They just need the ventilator. It's kind of big, it's not used a lot that way, but it's for demonstration purposes. You'll see some of anybody at any of the post-acutes or at where they have ventilators? See anything yet? No? Not yet? Yeah, what do they have there? The Trilogies?
I forget what it's called.
Oh, okay.
We have a ventilator. Oh, they're all the same, I think.
Yeah, it's probably a vent called the Trilogy, which is a long-term vent. Okay, so let's talk about our circuit, and I have this thing here to just help you demo and see what it looks like. Pretty straightforward, but you'll see that, and this was part of your homework too, is every circuit is gonna have an inspiratory side and an expiratory side. I like to use this at first because it has an extra water trap that we don't have built into it. So, let's see, Devin, can you tell me how I know which side is inspiratory and which side is expiratory?
Is the blue side the inspiratory?
What would tell me though besides color? You two keep your hands down. Was it a homework question?
Yes.
Do you have your homework? You can look it up if you need to. Or did you just put the blue side?
That was my main.
It's something that's in the one side only.
The trigger valve?
No. The trigger valve, no. It's the, RJ, you know? How do I know which side is inspiratory or expiratory, but not with color? What side, what would tell me it's an inspiratory side?
Humidifier.
Yeah, the temperature probe, that's in here. It's right down here, it's right down here. So the only extra piece I wanna show you on this one, and then I'm gonna get my real circuit out, is this. This is a water trap. And it can be, stays in the sim lab too, so you guys can get pictures if you want to, but this is a built-in water trap, and it's really nice because you can suction the water right out of it without having to open your circuit. So, a lot of the circuits have the built-in water traps. Ours does not. So, you need to identify your circuit by, I'm coming right back in the view of that. At least I hope. So this is the circuits that we have here. Huh? Oh. So, but you can't go by color because a lot of circuits are the same color. So the way you know it's inspiratory is where the inspiratory temperature probe goes, which we'll show you and I'll talk about. If it doesn't have a temperature probe, then you can pick either side. Just make sure you know which side you're running inspiratory on and which side you're running expiratory, okay? This one also has heated wires in it. Within it, you'll see there's coils. Those coils work to keep the temperature the same as, or as close to the temperature in the actual heater itself to keep it consistent. What would happen if my temperature inside my heater was warm and the circuit is cold, Kalia?
And you're the wrong switched, like is it the wrong, like connecting it?
There's no wires, so the temperature in the heater is a lot warmer than the temperature in the tubing. And so this is gonna be colder air. What happens when warm air goes to cold air? Turn one. RJ, do you know? It'll have condensation. So you guys, this is where this is really important, and water in your tubing is not your friend. Warm air holds more moisture than cold air does. So if your ventilator air is going into a nice warm heater and then going into a circuit that's cold, what will happen is the cold air won't hold as much moisture and it drains out and it falls out and comes into your circuit and then gives you what is known as rain out, which causes a lot of problems in the tubing. It makes the tubing dance, what we call dance. It can interfere with pressures and all kinds of things. So we don't want a lot of rain out. And rain out will drive your vent crazy too. If it gets in valves or other things you have hooked in, it's a nightmare. So heated wire circuits help with that. And then sometimes even you have to do more. You might have patients who have fans blowing on them, that you have tile floors, which is colder, and the circuit's down by the floors. So even though it has a heated wire in it, you're still having rain out. So sometimes you have to wrap these with something, towels, or put blankets over it to help keep it warm so you don't have rain out problems, because they will drive you crazy, especially all the valves and connectors. So inspiratory side, expiratory side. Move this out the way now. It's like to fall over. Essentially, if you needed to, this circuit could be put together with nothing more than 2 pieces of corrugated tubing and what we call a Y connector, because it looks like a Y. So the Y just takes 2 tubes and splits it down to 1. That could go to my Ballard, my endotracheal tube, whatever. So any place, yes, Haley?
Is there only a water trap on the expiratory side?
There could be other things. There could be nebulizer things. They hook to humidifiers. That was just one example.
There's never a water trap on the expiratory?
No, it could be both. It usually is both. We just had one. So good question. Your water trap set places will be on both sides. And they're literally made, if you have them, so you can just attach a suction tubing to it and it sucks the water right out. It's very good. Because you want to try to not open your circuit. Remember we talked about VAP last week. So within the air delivery from the ventilator to my patient, I have to worry about what we call dead space. Dead space is basically anything we add to our circuit that air can just deposit and not go to the patient to participate in gas exchange. So the longer the tubing, the more air that can get lost along the way. Just like water does, little water will always be left behind if you're trying to go through a long area. So will air, Mitch.
Does your would you set in a setting on your ventilator to compensate for any dead space added, or you just
Not
have
an
to-
actual setting,
you just
so.
have to increase pressure or volume?
Yeah, it doesn't come up a lot unless you're on really tiny volumes, and it's not something that you're going to talk about every day in your clinic setting and wherever you go work, but it's something that you need to be aware of, because especially patients who are on vents long term, they love to add extra stuff to their circuits. Yeah.
Isn't that like factored in though when you calibrate it?
It is for the circuit,
Yeah,
but anything beyond the circuit does not get calibrated in. And actually, anything beyond these two tubes does not get calibrated in. Even this little Y piece adds a little bit of dead space. So when we add in a Ballard to here, we add in dead space. And by the way, no circuits on the floor. If you add in other little connectors on here, you add in dead space. If you add in an HME, which we talked about and we'll go over, we talked about last term, we'll just talk about where they go, you add in dead space. So the more things you add from the Y to the patient's endotracheal tube is making dead space. And what dead space is think about the word, it's dead space. It's adding places for air to just sit and not ever get to my patient's alveoli to participate in gas exchange. So if I add in all this extra dead space, what's it gonna do to my ventilation?
those numbers all change.
It's gonna make it go down.
It's not gonna be
So adding excess dead space can increase CO2. And they ask this sometimes on the boards just because they want to see that you understand the concept of if you add a bunch of things onto your circuit, you could affect your patient's ventilation.
Wait, you said adding excess dead space increases?
Increases CO2. And while taking away dead space will do what? It'll have the opposite effect. It will decrease the CO2. Patients who are on 500 milliliters of volume and they're adults and we're just adding one or two little things, not a big deal. But think about a baby who might only be getting 100, and I know this is not the neonate class, but it's just the good example to use. Oh, we're about to take a break. Anyways, you have somebody who's only 100 or 200 cc's of volume and you add 100 mLs of dead space. You just cut their tidal volume in half. Because whatever that dead space is, you have to subtract it from the tidal volume, and that is what's actually getting to your patient. So just think for a reference, corrugated tubing, there's those little lengths, right? That you guys can cut. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Those little lengths. There's a little round split. Each one of those adds 50 cc's of dead space. So just think of that as a reference point.
Which one?
The corrugated tubing, do you remember seeing the little ringlets? Let me just grab one real quick and I'll show you.
the ones like setting up the
So they
aerosols.
can't-
cc's of dead space.
Hold on one second. So each little section, you guys, this is one section, this is one section, this is one section. So each little section adds in 50 cc's or mLs of dead space. That's what I was talking about. Luna?
Okay, so on the vents, that's when you would put it on the pressure SIMV, so you would get enough pressure there, because they would have to, like.
Not
the pressure
necessarily.
would backfeed and still show the correct pressure.
No,
technically.
I mean, the amount of pressure is gonna give you a certain amount of volume, but you're still gonna have the dead space. That's not gonna take that away. So if you, just in a theoretical, hypothetical situation, if you added, let's say 4 tubings here, that's 3, 4. That's 200 cc's of dead space. I need to know that I'm dropping my patient's tidal volume by 200 mLs, and I might need to increase it to compensate for that.
But wouldn't the pressure compensate for the distance, the loss, because it would still have to go off pressure? So it would get the correct pressure to the patient and get the correct pressure
But it's
back.
gonna take more pressure to go through a longer tube than a shorter tube. So you would still get less volume.
That's why you don't,
Because you reach
daisy chain on the oxygen tube.
Yeah.
Quicker, so you have less tidal
Yeah.
volume getting to the patient.
It's gonna take more pressure to get through a longer hose than a shorter hose, just because of distance.
Just imagine breathing through a really, really long
Questions on that so far?
So
Any
es-
other ones?
So essentially,
Yes.
the more the dead space, the higher you would need to make the tidal volume.
Yeah, I mean, you have to
Makes sense.
offset, should we take away dead space or do we increase our tidal volume? That's when you're just gonna have to decide based on your patient situation.
Yeah, because if they had an HME or something, you could say, okay, do we take the HME off?
Right.
Or do we increase the tidal volume?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any questions? All right, take a break, be back at 9:35.